The topic of sacrifice is of considerable interest to religious studies, as well as to philosophy and theology. And with my paper, I would like to contribute to today's discussion on this very relevant topic. My paper aims to compare René Girard's theory of sacrifice, which is well known and discussed in many disciplinary fields, and that of Joseph de Maistre, which today is somewhat forgotten and neglected, even by philosophers of religion and theologians. More precisely, I intend to show that de Maistre's theory of sacrifice, which Girard considers outdated, is still helpful in understanding the nature of sacrifice, particularly bloody sacrifice, and the role that sacrifice plays within Christianity. I would therefore like to suggest a kind of backward path from Girard to de Maistre in order to understand the limits and the inconsistencies of Girardian theory of sacrifice, but also to highlight beyond the apparent contrast some points of agreement between Girard and de Maistre, especially regarding the conception of sacrifice in Christianity. My paper is divided into two parts. In the first part, I move from the criticism that Girard raises in the first pages of his best-known book, La violence et le sacré, to de Maistre's theory of sacrifice, and in turn, I develop a criticism of the functionalist conception of sacrifice that Girard proposes in this book. My criticism aims to show that Girard's refusal to consider sacrifice as an act having an ethical and religious meaning makes the sacrifice itself incomprehensible. In this part, I will discuss four aspects of the Girardian theory of sacrifice that seem questionable to me. First, the thesis that the properties of innocence and guilt are not significant for the choice of the victim, and therefore the idea of a relative indifference of the latter. Second, the Girardian conception of the sacred, which is reductive, or at least it seems to me reductive, because it denies, from a methodological point of view, the existence of divinity or a supernatural power. Third, the ambiguity of his conception of religion, which on the one hand needs the idea of transcendence to distinguish legitimate and illegitimate violence, and on the other hand deprives this idea of any proper religious determination. Four, Girardian anti-sacrificial conception of Christianity, which is based on a questionable exegesis and theology, ends up raising a claim to the exclusivity of Christianity, which is difficult to justify from his disciplinary point of view, and it seems to me in contradiction with the basic assumption of this theory of sacrifice, according to which the proper function of sacrifice is to stem indiscriminate violence in society. In the second part of my paper, I highlight the essential characteristics of the de Maistre theory of sacrifice as he presents them in his essay Éclaircissement sur les sacrifices. It's a small work that Demestre wrote together with his masterpiece, Les Soirées de Saint-Pétersbourg, intended to clarify some aspects of theodicy's doctrine that he proposes in this latest work. I don't believe that all the claims Demestre raises in this essay are still justified or valid, and nor do I believe his conception of sacrifice is exhaustive. However, his treatment of sacrifice, divided into 3 points, sacrifices in general, human sacrifices, and the theory, Christian theory of sacrifices, is still helpful for understanding the nature of sacrifice in general and the bloody sacrifice in particular. What seems especially interesting is underlining of the ethical religious meaning of sacrifice. That is the idea that sacrifice is understandable only by considering the human awareness of guilt for having done something bad or terrible, and of anger that this guilt arouses in the supernatural power. Starting from this idea, the Master considers sacrifice as an act of expiation that directly affects the guilty person or an innocent being, animal or human, who in this way atones for others who are guilty. The universal belief in the atoning virtue of the innocent for the sins of others is called by the Master the dogma of reversibility. According to him, this dogma belongs to all primitive and ancient culture and religions, but it's characteristic only of Christianity in its pure form. I will therefore support, in conclusion, the thesis that the Master's conception of Christianity is in a certain way, like that of Girard, anti-sacrificial, but in a sense that preserves sacrifice within Christianity, because consider Christianity as the unique religion that affirms without abuse and misunderstandings the dogma of reversibility. Due to time limits in this video, I will only present the first part of my paper.
Girard's theory is much more convincing once freed from the burden of being the first human act, and from the need to become the explanation for all religious phenomena. To eliminate primal murder is to recognize that the crisis is not the foundation of order, but the result of the fragility of social system, of the exit from the specific rules of an animal that became man by becoming other than itself. One should not be fooled by the fact that the phenomena of social disintegration manifest themselves in a bloody way. Mimetic violence is not the cause, but the result of the deconstruction of relations based on that. What is meant to be hidden by the immolation of victim is not his innocence, but the weakness of the system. The goat polarized the human inability to perceive oneself as weak, to understand that the construction of rules and models is nothing but a change of anxiety and fears from which is not possible to free oneself. The obsession with guilt, the focus on a victim's choice that excludes the spread of revenge are tools aimed at solving an internal problem within social hierarchies. If sacrifice were only preventive, anger and fear could not explode, dragging everything and everyone down. There is no divine responsibility at this level. On the contrary, it's the huge silence of the gods that triggers the questions. Who is the guilty? Girard is right when he says that the crisis corresponds to the loss of sacrifice. But what he doesn't understand is that what is lost is not the ritual he describes. The immolation of the scapegoat has a reparative function. It is an emergency tool to be used when the system of difference is no longer able to perpetuate itself peacefully. And it could not be otherwise, because the collective emotion of lynching, while capable of uniting what is falling apart, is not lasting in its effects. Far from being mutually exclusive, the retributive function of religious sacrifice and the immunizing function of scapegoating can coexist, provided we recognize that they respond to different issues. The first has to do with the thinkability and construction of a human order. The second, with the need for stability in a system that rests on precarious balances.
During the first 5 centuries of the Christian era, the clash between the traditional religion called paganism by the Christians and the newly born Christian religion centered on the sacrifice. As Jan Bremmer wrote, there can be little doubt that animal sacrifice was the most important and significant ritual act of both Greek and Roman religion. Moreover, this ritual was simultaneously a religious and political act. The civic community mediates human relationships with the divine word through the religious system, aiming to obtain divine favor, in Latin called pax deorum, which means peace with the gods. When the Roman Empire conquered the Mediterranean area and a part of Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, the emperor, the head of the Roman religion, was also considered a god while still alive. People worshipped him spontaneously, motivated by tradition, feasts, and loyalty towards the emperor, who granted them a peaceful life. In AD 33, in Jerusalem, the Roman crucified Jesus of Nazareth as a rebel. After 3 days, Jesus was resurrected by the Holy Spirit. This belief, shared by all his disciples then and now, gave birth to a new religion called Christianity. Christians worshipped only their God and did not practice animal sacrifices to honor pagan gods or to honor the Roman emperor. The contemporaries perceived this attitude as a rebellion against the Roman order and a threat to the good relations between the civic community and the gods. The Christians' conduct had no criminal profiles other than the refusal to sacrifice. Around the beginning of the 2nd century AD, the Emperor Trajanus established a procedure in case of a denouncement for being Christian. The defendant had to prove his innocence from the accusation by worshipping pagan gods in the court. The sacrifice was a crucial element. In the middle of the 3rd century AD, the Roman Emperor Decius issued a general provision intended to reach everyone in the empire, ordering to sacrifice to the gods in the presence of commissioners and eat the sacrificial meat. In case of the refusal to sacrifice, the sanctions were jail, exile, property loss, torture, and death. The emperor, in order to overcome the ongoing military and economic crisis of the empire, tried to regain the favor of the pagan deities through sacrifice. Decius established a clear view of the pagan religion centered on sacrifice. Not performing the cult act meant opposition towards the empire. The Christians, suffering persecution, developed the idea of religious freedom. At the beginning of the 3rd century AD, Tertullianus a pagan converted to Christianity, affirmed that religious freedom is a fundamental right established by nature. Therefore, it is beyond the approval or disapproval of the public authority. Its content consists of letting everyone worship the gods he chooses, according to his convictions. Moreover, as an immediate consequence, not forcing anyone to sacrifice. A significant change occurred in the second decade of the 4th century AD, when Constantine, a newly converted Christian, became emperor. He recognized religious freedom for Christians and everybody alike. However, the emperor's tolerance was short-lived. Constantine righted the wrongs suffered by the Christians during the persecution and subsidized the Christian church with public funds. Moreover, he began to oppose paganism, first of all by hindering pagan sacrificial rituals. He was disgusted by animal sacrifice, and this religious choice oriented his action as a lawmaker. He labeled the pagan religion superstition and forbade contaminating the temples with bloody sacrifices. The Emperor Constantine's son, issued a law in which it was written, "Superstition shall cease, the madness of sacrifices shall be abolished." Some years later, the Christian emperors ordered to close the pagan temples. The emperors Valentinianus and Theodosius condemned to exile, I quote, "the insane who sacrificed and everyone who approached a shrine or a temple to worship." They also indicated how everyone should pray. 10 years later, the Emperor Theodosius forbade worshipping pagan gods and familiar deities even in the close of private houses. Christianity initially challenged the unity of religion and politics and experienced persecution until the unity was restored when the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its religious ideology. Hence, the root cause of the denial of religious freedom in the public and private spheres. Furthermore, controlling all the religious acts determined the ban on the sacrifice to the pagan gods. Given the evolution of Christianity, a Christian sacrifice replaced the pagan sacrifice. The Christian sacrifice was abstractly bloody through the symbols of bread and wine, in which different Christianities recognize a more or less intense actual presence of the Christ.
In my speech, I will focus on something that is usually overlooked in contemporary debates on religious sacrifice. As is known, sacrifice has been investigated from the viewpoint of numerous religious cultures and scientific disciplines. Unsurprisingly, the views of sacrifice that have emerged are equally numerous and exceedingly varied. It's possible to claim that decades of debates in which substantial reflections have been offered have provided very little assistance in clarifying sacrifice in itself. As has been said, we still need to make it clear what we mean by sacrifice. It's my conviction that we also still need to ask ourselves whether religious sacrifice can be seen as able to shape life in its entirety, which means that every act taken by religious believers may be deeply characterized by sacrifice. In my speech, I show that this view of life and sacrifice, the view that religious sacrifice shapes life in its entirety, is stressed by representative figures from Christian tradition, such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. I divide my speech into 4 sections. In the first section, I focus on the doctrine advocated by Augustine and Aquinas, the doctrine which I just mentioned, according to which sacrifice may shape life in its entirety. It's an influential doctrine, based on which sacrifice is seen as an act of directing everything to God. I then argue that this doctrine applies to important acts taken by religious believers. These acts are prayer, faith, and intellectual activity, and to them I devote the remaining sections of my speech. Let me now briefly focus on these sections, starting with the doctrine that sacrifice means directing everything to God. Augustine offers an extensive treatment of this subject. He says that the sacrifice applies to the whole experience of believers. He says that human beings themselves are sacrifice. Their body is sacrifice. What does Augustine mean? His view is that if we love God and see Him as our supreme good, then everything we are ready to give up with the aim of attaining communion with Him can be considered a sacrifice. In this way, we honor God, and at the same time, we are those who really benefit from sacrifice. This view follows from the conviction that our good is nothing else than to be united to God. If we spiritually embrace God, then we are impregnated with true virtues in every activity we take. To put it otherwise, although the believer makes sacrifice in every activity she takes because of love for God, the activity in question will benefit from that sacrifice. Given time constraints, I cannot dwell on all of the activities I consider in my speech. Let me just say something on intellectual activity. Can intellectual activity conducted by religious believers be seen as a type of sacrifice? To answer this question, let me make a brief reference to Christian faith. According to Aquinas, the religious believer, at least the paradigmatic one, should adhere with certainty to divine revelation because of love for God and not because sufficient evidence in support of that revelation has been provided. This is very important for Christian believers, since crucial tenets of Christian revelation, such as the Trinity and the Incarnation, are by no means supported by full evidence. This means that firm adhesion to revelation is possible although intellectual requirements have not been met. The believer, at least the paradigmatic one, should be ready to sacrifice such requirements. She should be ready to believe even in the absence of appropriate evidence. This may also regard intellectual activity and not only faith. In fact, the intellectual activity conducted by Christian believers will certainly have to do with their religious beliefs, such as the existence of God, the origin of human life, the final end of our moral choices, and the like. In my speech, I argue that, at least in the footsteps of Aquinas, the fact that religious believers sacrifice fundamental intellectual requirements does not prevent them from obtaining intellectual rewards. Therefore, sacrifice shapes their intellectual activity. They are ready to give up unconclusive evidence because of love for God, and precisely due to this sacrifice, their intellectual activity receives benefits.
Who sacrifices what to whom? My intervention aims on one hand to establish a difference between the classical so-called pagan sacrifice and the Christian one. On the other hand, it aims to critically examine a specific point of the Christian sacrifice, namely the identity of the receiver of this act. First of all, however, we define sacrifice, each kind of, as an act in which one renounces one's own good or accepts a evil as an offer to gain a possible good or to avert a possible evil. We can analyze the practice of sacrifice by identifying its structural elements. The executor, who, the customer, on whose behalf, the object, what, whom, the receiver, to whom, the purpose, for what. Now let's see how to fill these placeholders regarding the classical ancient sacrifice. A priest, on behalf of a singular community, sacrifices some possessions, generally animals, to God, to gods, to a deity, in order to ask for the forgiveness of sins or to ask for special graces. Well, René Girard explains this process as a repetition of a social physics mechanism with which human groups survive, polarizing their violence against the victim and putting them to death. The first event is not technically a sacrifice. It is simply the killing of a social scapegoat which temporarily restores peace after a social crisis and which therefore become a god of peace and violence. This god of the social order requires other sacrifices with a constant frequency to appease their anger. In this way, the community exorcises the danger of falling back into a new social crisis by repeating the first event that had pacified it. That is the origin of religious myths and rituals, according to Girard's mimetic theory. In this framework, Christianity represents a sort of sabotage of the system. Christ fits into the logic of sacrifice to overturn it, showing the innocence of the victim and the original sin of mankind, which cannot survive without perpetuating this mystifying violence. This also produces a new concept of God with no violent sides. Effectively, if we try to apply the previous scheme to the Christian sacrifice, we face a big question. Christ, the executor, on behalf of God the Father, sacrifices himself for the forgiveness of sins, of human sins. To whom? That is a question. Who is the receiver of the sacrifice of Christ? Let's explore three possible answers. The first is, the receiver is God the Father. Now, this conception, which is nevertheless the mainstream in the history of Christianity, has a logic problem. The customer and the receiver are the same person. And if we take the dogma of Trinity, also the executor. But there's a bigger theological price. Is still a good God a God who kills his son to save man from sin? A God who delights in suffering? A God who makes the same human sacrifice of his son from which he had dispensed Abraham, moreover killing himself in a sort of masochistic Trinitarian schizophrenia? Or is he subjected to an accounting of transcendental blood, to a law of revenge and sacrifice from which he seems to progressively free us already in the Old Testament? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, blood for blood. Would he like this kind of sacrifice? What a novelty, what a revelation this one will be. Therefore, let's explore the opposite, apparently opposite answer. The devil is the receiver of the sacrifice. This is not the mainstream account for the Christian sacrifice. However, there is an historical exegetical line which dates back to Origen, Tertullian, and reaches up to Ambrose. All these authors interpret the meaning of Christ's cross exactly in that way. When St. Paul says, "You are not your own, you were bought at a price," in the first letter to the Corinthians, he refers to a ransom paid for liberation from a slavery, a very common practice in Corinth, by the way. Here, human sin is seen as a form of slavery, of non-freedom. Satan holds human beings as slaves to sin and demands the blood of Christ as a ransom. The theological problem here again is that God seems to respond to a kind of diabolic edict, which will be greater than his love and his power. I think we can overcome this problem and the apparent incompatibility between our first option and the second one if we consider Christ's sacrifice as a moment within the dynamic of Easter. Cross is precisely a passage towards the resurrection. In a kind of Hegelian move then, but it is rather Hegel, which derives his dialectics from the logic of Christianity, we can come to the third option, in which both the first and the second acquire their full meaning, I think. Human beings. Here, the forgiveness of sins, or the ransom for the liberation of human beings, is not the only purpose of the sacrifice of Christ. There is also another purpose, namely the revelation of the true law of God, which does not abolish the human law of retribution, nor the diabolic law of death in exchange for life, but rather overcome them in the name of free, priceless love for the others, friends and enemies. This over-rational, unexpected, divine love is the model that drives all our laws and all our actions towards an ultimate good. The criterion of truth of love, even today in the most secularized universe, is that it is the more authentic, the more it is free. That is the good news, the authentic revolution, or rather the revelation of Christianity. Thanks.